All right, I'll be talking about 8 specific joints, specifically talking about the shoulder joint, which is also called the glenoid-humeral joint, which is a ball socket joint, which has 6 movements: abduction, adduction, flexion, extension, external and internal rotation. Has 3 planes and 3 axes on the sagittal, transverse, and frontal plane. It also has 3 degrees of freedom, making it triaxial. Next, we have the neck bones, or the cervical spine. So that has the pivot joint. That is due to the atlas and axis. It has four movements of flexion, extension, and lateral extension and rotation. That has 3 planes, 3 axes on the sagittal, frontal, and transverse plane. 3 degrees of freedom, which means it's also triaxial. Next, we have the wrist, which is the carpal joint, which is a pivot joint. And it has 4 movements of flexion, extension, radial deviation, ulnar deviation, which means it's going to be sliding back and forth like that. It has 2 planes, has 2 axes on the sagittal and frontal, and has 2 degrees on the freedom, which makes it biaxial. Next, we have the elbow joint, which is the humeral ulnar joint. It has a hinge joint, and it has 2 movements of flexion and extension. It has 1 plane, 1 axis, and 1 degree of freedom. And that's on the sagittal plane, which makes it uniaxial. Next, we have the trunk, and for the trunk, I just included that sacroiliac joint, which connects the hip joint, or the hip bone to the spine, and then the spine to the sacral to the lumbar. And that's gonna be also kind of like a cartilaginous joint, so mostly cartilage supporting that joint. There's 4 movements: flexion, extension, lateral extension, rotation, and moves in 3 planes and 3 axes in the sagittal, frontal, and transverse plane. 3 degrees of freedom, which makes it triaxial. And the least active from researching is that lateral extension. Next, we have the hip, or the acetobulofemoral joint, which is a ball socket joint, which has 6 movements: abduction, adduction, flexion, extension. It has external and internal rotation, similar to the shoulder. It has 3 planes, 3 axes on the sagittal and frontal and transverse plane. It has 3 degrees of freedom, which also makes it triaxial. Next, we have the knee, or the tibiofemoral joint, which is a hinge joint. It's also a synovial joint. So there's going to be slight movement that allows 4 movements. Is going to be the flexion, extension, and then the limited rotation is going to be the external and internal rotation, which means it has 2 planes and 1 axis on the sagittal and transverse. 1 degree of freedom, which makes it uniaxial. And then for the ankle, and the last joint is the talocrural joint, hinge type synovial joint. So it's also similar. So I'll be talking about the 4 movements, which are plantar flexion, dorsal flexion, inversion, eversion. It has 2 planes, 1 axis on the sagittal and frontal, 1 degree of freedom, which makes it uniaxial. And that's it.